Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining today our statewide webinar on repurposed home BiPAP and split ventilation to extend respiratory support during the COVID-19 crisis. My name is Marcus Friedrich. I'm the Chief Medical Officer of the Office of Quality and Patient Safety here at the New York State Health Department. And it's with great pleasure for me to introduce today the Mount Sinai team. And I also want to thank Greater New York Hospital Association and HANYS for putting this webinar on. First of all, a couple of housekeeping items. There is a Q&A function on the Zoom link where you can submit any questions that we will discuss a little bit later. And this is like one on the series of webinars that we co-hosted with the Hospital Associations, Greater New York and HANYS and the hospitals to share approaches on the limited availability of critical care resources. As we all know, ventilators are in short supply and our hospitals are overrun by patients who need ventilations. And this and other solutions might help to address some of these limitations. It is a real pleasure for me to, as a physician, and I'm increasingly proud of how the healthcare community reacts to this, coming together in times of crisis and freely sharing this experience across hospitals and across other folks who might be trying something similar, and really talking about these approaches and also discussing some of the pitfalls. So with that, I want to hand it over to Dr. Charles Powell, who is the director of the Mount Sinai Respiratory Institute, a professor of pulmonology, critical care, and sleep medicine. Dr. Powell?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for us to be here and have the opportunity to speak with everyone. I'm speaking now on behalf of Dr. David Rich, who's president of Mount Sinai Hospital and chief operating officer of Mount Sinai Hospital. What we want to demonstrate today is the culture of innovation at Mount Sinai and our interdisciplinary collaborations that allow us to create solutions to address the most pressing needs. Of course, the most pressing needs at the moment are to be able to match the demand of patients coming into all of our health systems with mild, moderate, and severe critical illness due to COVID-19. So what we've been able to do from this interdisciplinary team of pulmonologists, critical care physicians, anesthesiologists, decision science experts is to develop two solutions that can increase the capacity of ventilators that can be available to meet the anticipated surge. And this, of course, is on top of our efforts that have been going on in the past several months to acquire ventilators through more typical streams, purchase, and/or rental. Each of the presenters here will represent the disciplines that I mentioned, and they will introduce themselves as we go around the room. We will also give you a live demonstration of our repurposed ventilator setup and of our split ventilator protocol, and there will be time for questions at the end. What I thought I might do is to set the table and tell you the protocol that we developed and how we developed protocol for the split ventilator system. So several weeks ago, we received a donation from the Tesla Corporation of 300 BiPAP devices, the ResMed BiPAP ST devices, that are typically used in the home setting and deliver ventilation via mask. And so as we were preparing to increase our supply of ventilators, the question came, can we use these home ventilators to deliver ventilation to critically ill patients, not through a mask interface, but through an endotracheal tube? Well, amongst the interdisciplinary teams we have at Mount Sinai, we have a world-class sleep physiology team. In fact, David Rappaport, who leads the sleep research program, is an inventor of the BiPAP protocol. So he led the team that was able to quickly develop a protocol where we could adapt the ResMed device to deliver ventilation to invasively intubated patients in a very quick time. It took about a day to have a protocol that was feasible and reasonable and safe, that of course incorporated filters for the exhaled ports such that virus would not be expelled into the air. This device was tested the next day in the simulation center that is set up by our anesthesia team. It's a world-class facility again. We're able to test the device, able to run it to its limits, know what it could do, know what it couldn't do, and we were able to make adjustments so that we could install monitoring capability so we would know the inspired concentrations of oxygen, the exhaled tidal volumes and flows, the exhaled CO2. We made those modifications, brought it back to the simulation lab, showed that they worked, and were able then to bring the system into the clinical setting where it was able to support patients who were stable after recovering from acute COVID respiratory failure. So in brief, that is the overview of our approach. And I just want to emphasize that this would not have been possible without close collaboration, a drive for intense innovation that is required to be able to meet this unprecedented surge in the number of patients who require invasive mechanical ventilation at our health center and in health centers around the city, the state, and the country. Now, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Hooman-Poor, who will give us more details as to the VPAP setup and how it works.
Thank you, Dr. Powell. My name is Hooman-Poor from the Division of Pulmonary, Critical Care, and Sleep Medicine. So I'm going to talk about the ResMed VPAP ST system that we have repurposed for ventilator support. So as you know, for ventilator support with patients with COVID respiratory disease, a ventilator can deliver high amounts of oxygen via high FiO2, and it provides positive pressure to reduce the work of breathing. A ventilator pushes air in, so the muscles of inspiration do not have to work as hard to suck air in. It also provides positive and expiratory pressure to prevent open alveoli from collapsing. But it's important to note that there are many modes of ventilation, and irrespective of the mode of ventilation, what the ventilator does is that it increases airway pressure for a set amount of time, and that results with airflow into the patient, and it culminates in a delivered tidal volume. So we have another machine that increases airway pressure, and that is CPAP for obstructive sleep apnea. So in this situation here, the airway collapses at night and results in intermittent obstruction. And a CPAP machine increases airway pressure to prevent that collapse from happening and to treat obstructive sleep apnea. And so with this donation of these ResMed bi-level devices, again, bi-level being different from CPAP in that you have the ability to increase the airway pressure above a set pressure, we were able to model this after pressure control ventilation, which is a standard mode of ventilation on our ventilators. In pressure control mode of ventilation, we increase the airway pressure and deliver flow for a set amount of time above the PEEP. And so with the bi-level machine, instead of a PEEP, we set our expiratory positive airway pressure, and then the IPAP is the total pressure in the system, the inspiratory positive airway pressure with the inspiratory time. How we set this up is this is the device, the ResMed VPAP ST device. We placed an antimicrobial filter, and we were able to feed in and bleed in oxygen from the wall. Ultimately, you can bleed in as much as you want. The higher you bleed in the oxygen, the higher your FiO2. It was important to have an exhalation port with this tubing. Again, this is not a closed circuit. It is one kind of tube, and so there's a separate exhalation port here. Up here, there's a viral filter. Again, this is not a closed circuit, and one of the main concerns with patients with COVID pneumonia would be aerosolizing the virus and exposing healthcare workers. And so having that viral filter was a key piece. We placed a gas sampling adapter to be able to monitor the flow, the pressure, and the gases, the delivered oxygen, the end tidal CO2 with this monitor from GE. We placed a heat and moisture exchanger, HME, to allow for humidification, and ultimately this was attached to the endotracheal tube. So, as Dr. Powell mentioned, we are using are going to use this machine for patients who are stable, because the important factor is that this machine can only provide positive pressure up to 25 centimeters of water. So the inspiratory pressure, the IPAP, can only go up to 25, but it turns out that most patients with COVID respiratory disease have extraordinarily compliant lungs for their disease and thus do not require as high pressures. And so for those who have demonstrated some degree of stability, particularly an FiO2 less than 85%, and with these other parameters, to be able to deliver the necessary pressure, so a PEEP less than 15, a driving pressure being the plateau pressure minus the PEEP if you're on volume control mode, or the inspiratory pressure on the pressure control mode should be less than 20. However, the sum of these two has to be less than 23. Again, our machine cannot increase the airway pressure to above 25.
Thank you, Hooman. And before we move on to talk about the split ventilator protocol, I just wanted to add one more feature that we incorporated into the repurposed BiPAP device, and that's the ability to monitor the parameters of the ventilator from outside of the room, and furthermore, with linkage, to be able to control the ventilator from outside of the room. And so what that will allow us to do is to avoid needing to go into the room to make a minor change to the ventilator. In fact, it is also possible to set up a central monitoring station where multiple ventilators can be monitored and controlled from a single location. So now we're going to move on and talk about the second innovation that was occurring in parallel by our same partners who participated in the repurposed BiPAP project. And that initiative was led by Dr. Matt Levin from the Department of Anesthesiology, Perioperative and Pain Medicine.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Powell. I'm a cardiac anesthesiologist by day, but have now become a ventilation expert in about a week. So we started this project, actually, Dr. David Rich approached us because there were some videos floating around on the internet showing this being done as a proof of concept. And so we convened a kickoff meeting and said, well, we see some shortcomings. Sorry, one moment, I'm going to switch microphones. Hello, is that better? Okay. So I'll just start again briefly. So we had there was some videos floating on the internet, and so we had a kickoff meeting with Dr. Rich and talked about the ways in which we thought there were some potential shortcomings to the approach being shared widely across YouTube and other platforms. The key being we thought we needed some valves in there to be able to control basic parameters of the amount of volume and pressure given to each patient. So we prototyped something in the lab, and we rapidly wrote a emergency consent protocol, which was reviewed and approved by our legal counsel as something that was appropriate in a crisis. We engaged with a device manufacturer to begin making prototypes of a valve that would be appropriate for use in humans, and that we could pursue an emergency use authorization for. And within about a week, we got to the point of being able to trial this approach in our first 2 consented patients. And for 1 hour, we were able to share ventilation with one machine ventilating 2 patients, and the patients having differing tidal volumes and pressures, and being able to compensate for a respiratory acidosis in one without affecting the ventilation of the other patient. And we trialed again last night with another 2 consented patients with now on our 3rd version of our prototype valve. So we're moving extremely rapidly, and it's just been an incredible collaborative effort between respiratory therapy and us, and the Division of Sleep Medicine and the pulmonologists and the intensive care doctors, and even all the way down to the transporters who are willing to move patients around at 10 o'clock at night to co-locate them in an ICU room so that we can do them. And the last thing I add before I'll turn it over to Dr. Shah and Dr. Chen to describe some details of the testing and the protocol, is just that, like Dr. Poor said, monitoring is extremely important. So part of our protocol and the way we've set up, which other people around the world are realizing, is you have to have individual monitoring of each patient's respiratory and ventilatory parameters.
I'll introduce Dr. Chen and Dr. Shah, who represent the Department of Anesthesiology, Perioperative Medicine, and Pain Medicine, and represent also the Institute for Critical Care Medicine at Mount Sinai.
Again, my name is Anjan Shah. Like Matt, general anesthesiologist by day, now an expert in ventilation. But I also had the training and expert in simulation, did simulation fellowship. So all the protocols that, in a collaborative effort that we've described or that Matt has described, we first tested it in our high fidelity simulation lab, where really the two mannequins that we have are modeled as closely as possible to human lung compliance, chest wall compliance, and that really let us push and test the valves that we've been reiterating and changing the design to make sure that it was as safe as possible and reacted as we thought it would before we trialed in human patients. And with the high technology from CAE Healthcare, the human patient simulators, and their non-linear lung compliance modeling, we were able to show that the valves did work before we pushed it onto real patients.
Excuse me, I'm Martin Chen. I'm one of the cardiac anesthesiologists and intensivists in the Department of Anesthesia and the Institute of Critical Care Medicine. So it was really fantastic that we were able to test these and develop protocols in the simulation lab to such a degree that we were able to implement this in patients as safely as we could. This is obviously an extraordinarily dangerous type of device to use, and having the simulation data, we were able to very rapidly develop a protocol that we could use in our human patients. And we were able to demonstrate the same kind of results, that we could offer differential ventilation, differential driving pressures, differential minute ventilation to these patients using the same ventilator, using a pretty simple valve. With the monitoring and the protocols that we developed in the sim lab, we were able to do this safely in patients, and we were able to collect enough data to demonstrate that it's something that could potentially be used if we were forced to.
Okay, so another example of our, I'll bring it back to you in 1 second, if I could. Our team science approach is that everything that we do, we want to make immediately available to the medical and the scientific community. So the repurposed ventilator protocol is freely available on the Mount Sinai COVID-19 website. Please feel free to access it. And I don't want you to think that we're all talk and no show. We are going to show you exactly how these devices work with a demonstration.
This is Dr. Levian. I just wanted to emphasize something that Dr. Tennant said, which is that the shared ventilation is very dangerous. We are doing this as a last resort approach if we were to truly run out of ventilators, but we're not thinking of it as anything that should be done routinely. And the trialing that we're doing is in the context of gaining experience. So I want to be very clear, because there's a lot of concern and objections from the many societies, the anesthesia societies, the critical care societies. And we feel that we've addressed many of the objections, but we strongly 100% agree that this is a very dangerous thing to do, that we're not advocating it unless we get, and only if we get to the point of really exhausting our single ventilator supply.
Let's move to the demonstration.
Hi, my name is Drew Copeland. I'm the Director of Operations for the Mount Sinai Sleep Program, and I'm going to walk you through a real-life prototype of our repurposed home bi-level unit. So the unit we're using right here is the ResMed BiPAP ST. The only criteria we need for the blower is that it provides therapy in spontaneous timed, or ST mode. This particular unit has a max pressure of 25 centimeters. But if there is a unit that has a higher point of 30 centimeters, that can be used as well with our modified circuit. The first piece of the component here is the viral filter. The next we have here is the oxygen bleed-in valve. This would be connected directly to the oxygen regulator at the wall. Our tubing here does contain an exhalation port in it. If supplies are limited, a normal set of tubing with an additional piece, a T connector with an exhalation, can be substituted. And within our circuit right here, this oxygen bleed-in valve and this T piece are probably the pieces that could be most easily 3D printed if needed. On the outside of our exhalation port, we have this filter. Obviously, that is put there to prevent aerosolized COVID from exiting through the exhalation port. Here's the gas sampling and spirometry unit that we've added to our circuit, and I'm going to have Dr. Lai speak a little bit more about that. And the final piece that Dr. Poor referenced is this heat moisture exchange. What we're looking for in this piece is an HME with the least amount of dead space and the highest moisture. We don't recommend these as a long-term option. And so for those patients who are going to be on this unit for an extended period of time, you should consider adding in actual heated humidification using a reservoir. At this point, I'll turn it over to Dr. Jing Wang to talk through some of the settings.
Okay, thank you, Drew. Hi, everyone. I'm Jing Wang from the Division of Pulmonary, Critical Care, and Sleep Medicine. So I just wanted to take everyone through the treatment screen, which is showing in real time the device set to bi-level ST mode, in which we have an expiratory PAP level or EPAP level that Dr. Poor previously referred to. This is equivalent to the PEEP. Above that, we have the IPAP level, which again, on this particular, the ResMed device can go up to a maximum of 25. The difference between the IPAP and the EPAP determines the driving pressure or delta pressure, which here is shown by the PS, and that will determine the tidal volumes achieved based on the patient's lung compliance. So again, like pressure control ventilation. In the bi-level ST mode, we will be able to set a mandated backup respiratory rate. The patient can breathe above this rate. Next, other parameters that can also be adjusted include the inspiratory time limits, which will be determined by the patient's set respiratory rate, as well as rise time, which is the time in which this device takes to reach the goal IPAP. And finally, the sensitivity triggers for breath cycling and triggering. Once patients are connected to this device, we do have a set of clinical protocols that will guide changes needed based on the patient's goal oxygenation and ventilation. And in addition, as Dr. Poor and Dr. Powell mentioned, patients getting this therapy can be remotely monitored outside of the isolation room via the attached monitor, which Dr. Lai will take us through.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Chukian Selina Lai. I'm a cardiothoracic anesthesiologist with the Department of Anesthesiology, Perioperative, and Pain Medicine at Mount Sinai Hospital. Today, I'll be talking to you about monitoring considerations for patients using the vPAP BiPAP machine as an invasive ventilator. Our basic guidelines is ensuring that every patient would be connected to a standalone monitor with basic end-tidal CO2, pulse oximetry, and fractional inspired oxygen monitoring at the minimum. At Mount Sinai Hospital, we are fortunate enough to be equipped with high-end GE CareScape monitors equipped with advanced alarm function, and included with our monitor is a dedicated spirometry module here that allows us to do gas sampling for carbon dioxide, oxygen, and also a spirometric module that allows us to get advanced data such as the patient's inspiratory and expiratory tidal volumes, which closely correlates to what is being delivered on the vPAP machine. We're able to see basic information like peak pressures, peak, and actually a calculated compliance and plateau pressures. Here, we also are able to see the pressure volume curves in our spirometry unit. Ventilator disconnect, but we can also diagnose potential situations, including ventilator dysynchrony, hemodynamic instability, and so forth. And this module especially, even though you don't see it here, we actually have the capability of attaching SpO2, and over here will also be a dedicated spot for invasive airway monitoring that can also be adjusted and customized for every patient. And as you can see here, we are able to customize our alarm parameters based on every patient's different ventilatory techniques. And we can actually set alarm priorities to really make sure that we don't have any alarms that are not reasonable. So
concluding what I'm saying. So patient safety, is our paramount, is of paramount importance in the use of these machines. And, and I'm going to bring it over now to the split ventilator team for the demonstration.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Rona Shah. I am one of the anesthesiologists here at Mount Sinai in the Department of Anesthesiology, Perioperative, and Pain Medicine. Like Dr. Anjan Shah, I also have an extensive background in simulation and education here at the Mount Sinai Health Simulation Lab. I just want to quickly go over our equipment here and our two mannequins, which will serve as our patients for the demonstration. These are, as we had mentioned previously, high fidelity human patient simulators, and we can alter respiratory physiology and cardiac physiology with any variable that we would want to that could simulate a real human. Now, just for the purposes of this demonstration, we have labeled these patients as patient B, which marks the red tape over here. Also over here, we have red marking, and also on the monitor that corresponds to this particular patient. Over here, we have patient A, and this is our monitor for patient A as well, and our circuitry for patient A. Now, the key components of our split ventilator circuit are three main things. One, you have your spirometry module that can individually detect our parameters for each individual patient continuously. We also have one-way valves to help prevent crosstalk between the two patients. And we also have 3D printed needle valves that can change the amount of flow that we're giving to one patient versus another patient. Now, just to kind of go through all of the components of our circuitry really quickly. We have our endotracheal tube. This patient is already intubated. We have our elbow. We have our HME filter, our heat and moisture exchanger, followed by our bacterial and viral filter as well. Now, this is our spirometry component that Dr. Selena Lai was mentioning, which can monitor your end tidal CO2 along with your inspiratory tidal volume, expiratory tidal volume, your peak and plateau pressures, and PEEP. Now, as mentioned before, this is our module over here with our GE monitors, which can help measure your end tidal CO2 and your spirometry. Moving on in terms of the actual circuitry, you now have your inspiratory and expiratory limbs. This is your inspiratory limb, and this is your expiratory limb. This is your one-way valve that we disconnected our actual limb from the Y piece and inserted a one-way valve so the air direction flow is only in one direction. Now, if we move on over here, this is the heart of our machine. These are needle valves that are 3D printed, and we can change the amount of flow that's going to one patient versus another patient. This is the inspiratory limb. You have your T piece with your female to female end connector that is connecting between the bacterial viral filter that's back into the inspiratory port of your ventilator. And over here, you also have your one-way valves on your inspiratory limbs as well that help allow the flow of direction in one way as well. Now, we have tested this also on ICU ventilators as well, in addition to this anesthesiology machine. Now, I want to bring your attention to the actual volumes that we have set for both of these patients. Now, we're going to assume that both of these patients are 70 kilograms each. We can change the amount of flow even if they did have different ideal body weights as well. That's important to remember. Based on the volumes that this particular patient's getting, patient A, you can see that they're getting about 550 mLs. Now, that's obviously high in terms of what we would expect based on their ideal body weight of 70 kilograms. It should be more at the maximum of around 420 mLs. This patient over here, patient B, is at that range. These patients already have undergone split ventilation. So we choose the patient that needs the higher driving pressure to obtain their targeted volume of 420 mLs. These are our ventilation parameters that we have set in terms of our inspiratory pressure, respiratory rate, and PEEP, our FiO2 over here. And this is the total tidal volume that we're giving between the two patients. Now, what we want to do from patient A, whose volume is around 550 mLs, is to bring it down to their targeted volume, which is about 420 mLs maximum if we're using the 4 to 6 mL per kilogram range. The way we do that is we use this valve over here, and we close this valve to help slowly titrate with fine control our tidal volumes. Now, as I start to close this valve, you will see a change in your tidal volumes on this screen, and you will see that patient B's volumes do not really change at all. Just give me a quick second. I do want to go slow to show that it is very fine control. You can see that the volumes are starting to come down from 550 down to about 500 right now. You can see your peak pressures, plateau pressures, and your PEEP as well. And keep an eye on those variables as well. Now, the value is now down to about 440, about 430, and about 426, which is close to our goal, about 423 now. As you can see with this patient, it has remained the same around 420, and their volumes have not changed at all. And the hemodynamics, if we point up to the board over there, that correlates to the patient A of which we changed. Those variables have stayed the same as well. Now, the advantage of these patient simulators is that when we change one variable based on the programming, everything automatically changes with it. So if we wanted to change something in terms of your cardiovascular physiology, other variables automatically change without us manually manipulating it. And based on that, since we haven't changed anything else, we can see that our hemodynamics have remained the same. Now, the way we came across this idea initially was actually using brass valves from a local hardware store. We use 3/4 inch valves, which is similar to our diameter in terms of our anesthesiology circuitry. And this is what we initially tested it. And we used these valves to open and close. And we connected it to all of our circuits. And we realized that this method actually ended up working. And because of that, we then went to a more medical type of grade material and had this 3D printed and actually then tested it, and it worked as well. Now, once again, to reiterate, split ventilation is incredibly dangerous. However, this does provide an extra level of security in terms of being able to manipulate the tidal volumes. So you could have 2 different patients with 2 different ideal body weights that you can control and through the same ventilator. It's not going to account for your PEEP or your respiratory rate or your FiO2. Those are still going to be the same for both patients, but it does allow one extra step in terms of being able to control for your patients. I will send it back to the panelists. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much from the simulation lab. Now it's my pleasure to turn the microphone over to Robert Friedman, who is Vice President, Mount Sinai Hospital for Clinical Innovation, and will moderate the question and answer session. Robbie.
Great. So just as a reminder, everyone can submit questions through Zoom, through the Q&A button on your screen. And so far we have, it's like a couple of questions. I'm going to switch microphones. Hopefully everyone can hear better now. So we have our first question that came in, which is, what ventilator setting are you utilizing? Is this a pressure control mode? I'll turn that over to our anesthesia team.
Yes, as with other split ventilator protocols that have been published, we're using pressure control in paralyzed patients. The advantages of pressure control are that we're able to change the driving pressures between patients with this device, but overall it's also a little bit safer because you won't have a steal of tidal volume from one to the other with different compliance in the other protocols. But yes.
We have another question that came in regarding how do we find out more information about the sim lab and any contact information for the valves, as well as the inspiratory lines that we're using.
So the Mount Sinai simulation lab, you can we can send out our contact information, but essentially my email anjan.shah@mountsinai.org, and then I can field it to whoever to kind of help better answer your question. I'm going to hand it over to Matt to talk about the valves.
So in terms of the valve, we're doing our final validation and testing. We're pursuing the emergency use authorization, and once that approval is obtained, then we would be able to provide more information about availability of these valves. Again, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, this is very, very dangerous and requires a lot of expertise to do. So if we ever do get to that point, we would want to proceed very cautiously. But the valves, the intent is to make them available as a device that's cleared under an EUA, and then would be available to audience members who are listening and others.
Okay, so the next question is, how do you prevent cross-contamination? Maybe Dr. Powell?
I'm going to send that one, if I could, to Dr. Rappaport. We have him on the line from New Zealand. David.
I'm not sure I'm the right one to respond to that. I think they're talking about the dual ventilator, but I assume there are valves in there. The bi-level doesn't require that because it's only one patient.
And as far as the split protocol goes?
Yeah, so in the split protocol, so we have one-way valves on each of the expiratory limbs so that the airflow is directed back towards the ventilator. And we also have one-way valves on each of the inspiratory limbs coming off of each of the flow control valves. Now, on the end of each of the limbs connecting directly to the machine, we have bacterial and viral filters. But on top of that, we also have a second layer of safety and have an additional bacterial and viral filters directly connected to the ET tube of each patient to try to minimize contamination and crosstalk in terms of volumes.
Okay, we'll move on. Thank you. We're going to move on to the next question. And this one is regarding the respiratory rate. With no independent respiratory rate control, isn't that a large issue to overcome?
Yes, and that's one of the major issues with the split ventilator overall. So without the valves, we have no control over how we're ventilating patients with different compliance. With an ability to control the driving pressure for each patient and being able to change sort of liberally tidal volumes between 4 to 6 or 4 to 8 cc's per kilo ideal body weight, you can actually substantially change the minute ventilation that you're providing to both patients. So although they are capped at the same rate, you can end up giving different tidal volumes and different degrees of minute ventilation that are substantially different. And in our clinical trials, we were looking at patients that were, in the 40s and in the 60s of ideal body weight. So reasonable differences in what we were intending to deliver as far as tidal volumes and minute ventilation.
And Marty, as far as the rate control goes, everybody is paralyzed, is that correct?
Everybody's paralyzed. And so you're linked by PEEP, FiO2, and respiratory rate, but we can change minute ventilation within the parameters that we're using with the driving pressure.
You answered our next question, so we'll move on. This one I think will be for Dr. Rappaport.
We like to stay one step ahead.
So I think Dr. Rappaport would best answer this question. It's that for a place that does not have inline spirometry, can we use a Dreamstation BiPAP without spirometry and just monitor saturation and end tidal CO2?
So there are two different pieces to this. One is the delivery of the ventilation, and yes, Dreamstation, or for that matter, any other bi-level, has to be a bi-level and not a CPAP, and that is a point that gets sometimes lost in the discussion. But if you use the bi-level of any sort, the circuit we have is essentially identical and in fact commercially available in part. The monitoring, however, is something you just add in addition. And we've chosen to put the monitoring because it's better to know what you're doing. And that does allow things to be further monitored and alarms set up, but it's not critical to the therapy. You could theoretically do this without actually knowing what you're doing to the patient and look only at the result manifested by saturation, for example, if that's all you have. It's obviously better to have the monitor, but not necessary.
Thank you, Dr. Rappaport. Our next question is around the 3D printed valves. And the question is if the valves are sterile.
This is Dr. Levin. So the valves are intended to be one use only. For breathing circuits, my understanding from working with regulatory is that breathing circuits are high-level disinfected, not sterilized. Maybe Dr. Powell or someone who has more familiar could chime in and confirm that, but this valve, when it's available, will be a one valve per patient use, and then will be discarded, and it will come as a approved medical device clean from the factory.
Okay, so our next question is regarding ventilator splitting. Do we use critical care monitors for all patients? Are there any insights we can provide on the monitors that we're using? And if anyone on the sim lab as well would want to speak more to the monitors that we showed and to the critical care. Okay, I'll turn it over to.
This is Martin Chen again. So yeah, we use critical care monitoring for all the patients in this. And one of the things that we added was inline spirometry to each individual patient so that we can have some estimate of what the tidal volume and driving pressures are that the patients are receiving. Again, you know, this is a new device that we are expecting to use if we use it under a crisis situation, an extraordinary situation where we anticipate we're going to have limitations on lots of things we can provide. For our initial protocol, we're talking about having continuous inline spirometry for both patients for a period of 6 to 8 hours to make sure that they're stable. And if we are not able to monitor continuously, then taking the monitoring lines, as the pulmonary group has talked, outside of the room and being able to come with a spirometer to monitor every hour or 2 hours to make sure that things haven't changed for the patients, in addition to blood gases and saturations. But monitoring is a critical portion of this because the valves have a very nonlinear resistance to airflow. And although we've designed them to be fairly stiff at the lower ranges, there's always the chance that they could inadvertently change and deliver different tidal volumes to the patients.
Okay, so our next question, I think we may have sort of answered this, but I will re-ask it, is around dysynchrony. So what happens with patients if they initiate breaths at a different level?
So similar to other split ventilation strategies, even with this device, we anticipate the patients need to be deeply sedated and paralyzed to be able to be synchronous with the device. If there are episodes of coughing or bucking, that's one of the reasons that we use pressure control, is that we'll be able to still be delivering similar pressures to the other patient, and it provides some level of safety. However, this really is something that should only be used in paralyzed patients.
Okay, the next question is really more operational, but how do we manage the anesthesia staff and teams to monitoring changing parameters on these patients? If we're going with more than one patient on a ventilator, how do we manage that operationally from a team perspective?
This is Dr. Levin. So far operationally, it consists of Dr. Chen and myself. So I'm not sure how you would operationalize this, but I think it has to be a team-based approach. And you would have to be working with respiratory and with any of your other colleagues, pulmonologists, whomever's going to be doing this. I mean, so for example, at the hospital now, we have a proning team that is multidisciplinary, that they are the people that are responsible for if it needs to be proned, and nobody else is doing it. If we need a patient proned, this team comes and they do it, and then they subsequently, so to speak, own that patient and follow them. So I would envision that operationally, if you got to the point of sharing ventilation, that you would have the same thing of a team that owns it. Obviously, it's going to be in communication with the primary providers, which is going to be intensivists, or people who have been conscripted to be intensivists. But there would have to be a core body of expertise to provide that service.
Okay, so our next question is asking to compare modalities versus BiPAP for split. And they noted that with the BiPAP, it probably requires less monitoring, less continuous monitoring and oversight versus the split ventilator. So I wonder if we could compare and contrast maybe using these two different modes.
They're markedly different. And David, please add on. So the BiPAP ventilator, it's a standard ventilator. It's used in standard fashion in the home, and it can be used in standard fashion within the hospital, and is an acceptable mode of ventilation as of today. The split ventilator protocol, as was clearly described by our colleagues, represents some challenges because of the interdependence of ventilation between the two patients. And that is why the split ventilator protocol is typically reserved for the situation when there are no other conventional protocols to use. David, do you have anything you would like to add?
Yeah, I think you've captured most of it. On the one hand, you have a fairly high-tech solution which allows you all the benefits of a conventional ventilator in many ways, but which requires a lot of resources to monitor and to administer safely. That would be the split ventilator concept. The bi-level concept is a kind of a rudimentary form of ventilation which will keep a patient alive, and especially a patient who is either recovering or who is not as sick as the others. And it seems to me that they're complementary approaches. I saw a question which actually relates to this, which I'll quickly try and contribute to. The extubation process, when you wanted to extubate or wean one of the two patients on the split ventilator, could potentially be managed, it seems to me, by switching to the lower tech bi-level approach for that patient when they become more stable, and either capping off that side of the circuit with either a simulator bag or just capping it entirely and allowing the other patient to continue until you put somebody else in their circuit. But then while moving the other patient as you slowly reduce the paralysis and work towards extubation. So I see these things as complementary. The bi-level is a kind of a cheap and dirty and will work for potentially a large number of people. The other is a high-tech solution which for selected patients may be beneficial.
This is Dr. Levin. So I think that's actually brilliant what you just said, because the split ventilation or the shared ventilation is so bulky, and then you're going to bring a third ventilator in there. But if you could bring the ResMed BiPAP in there, and then again, the beauty of the valves is you don't have to cap the circuit. You just turn the valve off, and now you've actually turned ventilation off to that patient, and you can do a quick circuit change. One thing that wasn't talked about at all, which is sort of a small detail, but when we're changing breathing circuits, we are clamping the endotracheal tube. And it's for two reasons. One is because we don't want to be spraying COVID everywhere. But the second is when you clamp, you preserve PEEP. So, you let someone open to room air and you'll just lose all their PEEP fairly quickly. I mean, that can be catastrophic in a patient with this type of lung disease. So, but it's a brilliant idea to use them in a complementary fashion. And, again, what Dr. Powell said, the BiPAP devices, they're single-use, single-patient ventilators. They're approved. There's nothing magical that you have to do to get someone to say, that it's comfortable with it. The shared ventilation is uncharted waters.
So there's a follow-up question to that, and I think we'll take one final question and then conclude. It's related to the PEEP for split vent, and the question is, are we able to manipulate the PEEP, or does it strictly manipulate volume only? And is there a blueprint for the valve that we're 3D printing available online?
I can answer the PEEP. So no, we aren't we aren't able to manipulate the PEEP right now. There are some other groups that are developing PEEP valves that potentially could be used independently. At this point, with what we were planning on developing, we really wanted to have something that was as simple as possible to deploy, because we expect that if we were to deploy this, it would be under a crisis situation. And having too many valves and too many components to the ventilator could potentially be, catastrophic. So although there are other groups that are looking at independent PEEP for split ventilators, and we'd be happy to look into it as well, because that would be a huge move forward. In this incarnation, we're really just looking at altering the driving pressures with something that limits flow and limits pressure on the inspiratory circuit.
At this time, the specifics of what we're developing with this device manufacturer are not going to be available. I mean, there are many. I'll leave it to the listeners to search the internet, but there's many concepts for 3D printed needle valves that you can see out there. I mean, the concept is very, very simple. As Dr. Chen says, we'd love to iterate to get to having PEEP valves. The thing about it is that you have to have an inline PEEP valve or something where you capture the expiratory gases, because standard PEEP valves that you would see on like a bag mask, a resuscitation bag, they leak air. That's how they provide the variable PEEP. So you have to capture that in. My understanding is that inline PEEP valves, used to exist fairly readily, and then I guess went away. And so that would be something that we're looking at as a second rapid iteration.
Okay, so I think for the last question, I'll turn it towards Dr. Powell, and just paraphrasing here, but the question is around what is our approach to human subjects research, and then are there consent considerations? And if you could, Dr. Powell, also, there are many more questions that we'll be able to answer due to our time constraint. So if there's a preferred method for people to reach us, either Twitter or one of our Mount Sinai email addresses, if you want to comment on that as well.
Sure. So as far as human subjects research goes, we certainly want to be able to determine the efficacy of these approaches, so that will be studied in the form of clinical research. As far as it pertains to these specific devices, the BiPAP device is really in essence a small conventional ventilator that is repurposed for a particular use using standard equipment. The use of this device itself is not considered to be research, but evaluation of it in terms of formalized clinical research will be done. It's different for the split ventilator protocol, and that's already been described by Dr. Levin and colleagues who have and are obtaining approved human subjects research protocolized approaches for this procedure, which, Matt, you want to discuss a little bit, please?
And so we from the get-go, before we approached any patients, we reached out to the director of the Program for Protection of Human Subjects and discussed the approach with him. And again, this is emergency consent for an unapproved device. And the model was, so we're also doing plasmapheresis here, where we're giving patients convalescent antibodies. So we modeled our consent on that, and prior to any patient being tested on the shared split ventilator, we speak with the legal representatives of their family, whether that's, or their legal representatives, I should say, whether that's a family or a designated other person, to make sure that we've explained all the risks up to including, death, and gotten consent. So we're very conscious of the nature of this, what we're doing. This is a crisis situation, so things are moving rapidly, but we are very, very aware and taking very seriously that we are asking patients to participate in something that has really no benefit to them, but can potentially benefit society. And we've been extremely fortunate that we've been able to find some patients, or rather their representatives, their family, loved ones, who have been agreeable to letting us do this. And the 4 patients that we've tried on are all alive still, and there was no issues during the trial, and they probably had the best monitoring in that hospital during those trials, because they had 2 cardiac anesthesiologists in the room. They had about a half dozen intensive care nurses and a couple other intensivists standing right outside. And we had ventilators, 3 ventilators in the room. So each of their own ventilators plus the shared ventilator. So we really tried to do this in the safest as humanly possible way that we could imagine. And we were successful.
Thanks so much. So I know we didn't get to all the questions. What we will do is we will go through the questions and we'll post our answers to the most frequently asked questions on our website. We have a COVID website where we have a page dedicated to these ventilator protocols. The repurposed ventilator protocols are all available, as I mentioned to you, on the web. We will have the answers to these questions on the web. If you don't have the website, I'm going to give you the email address for our program manager for this effort, who you met during the demonstration, and that's Drew Copeland. And his email address is Drew, D-R-E-W, .Copeland, C-O-P-E-L-A-N-D, @mssm.edu. We thank you for the opportunity to speak with you and to demonstrate our protocols and our approaches to try and be in best position to help all of us meet the challenges that we face as a result of this COVID pandemic. And now I'd like to turn the program back over to Dr. Frederick, CMO of Department of Health.
Thank you, Dr. Powell, and thank you all for presenting. I think it is fair to say, and Dr. Levin and Dr. Powell have mentioned that in normal times we would not have these discussions about ventilator and split ventilator protocols or BiPAP conversion, but these are not normal times, and I want to make that clear that our role in this, the Department of Health, is helping to offer some solutions and exploring solutions for the worst case scenario when we run out of ventilators. And the reason for having these webinars is making people aware not only about those solutions, but also the immense challenges. And thank you for all the presenters, what you've done. I just mentioned a couple, the external monitoring of each patient. This is not for every patient and not for every institution, and the team-based approach, but it could be a solution if worst comes to worst and we are running out of ventilators. And again, on a personal level, I hope my mother will not, get COVID. And if she does, I hope that she will not end up in the hospital. But if she does, I hope that she doesn't end up in the ICU. And if she does, I hope she has access to a ventilator, which, I won't be sure of. And if the ventilator is not available, I hope that somebody has thought about a similar protocol in some instances, because that could potentially save her life. So with that, I want to thank the Mount Sinai team for presenting and the great effort that went into that from the team here at DOH. I also want to thank again Greater New York and HANYS for all their support in this. We will continue with these showcases of showing solutions in the coming weeks, and we collected all your email addresses, and we want to keep this discussion going. Again, for the benefit of our patients and also for the benefit of the institutions. So with that, thank you all and have a great day, and keep working at those solutions. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.